because I have a philosophy of painting,
Mhm.
it was a great help to me. I think one of the problems that most artists have is they don't know what they want to paint or how they want to paint it. And I knew from the time I saw the Prometheus
Mhm.
how I wanted to paint. And I was fortunate that when I went to the Art Students League, I had these two great mentors. One was Robert Beverly Hale. I
Mhm.
got to hear his lectures maybe just a couple of years before he passed away. But I learned a tremendous amount, not just about anatomy, but um, well, I don't have anything to say about marketing, but I will give some advice to young artists that are out there. There's only one book in the world that I recommend to anybody, and it's The Drawing Lessons from the Great Masters by Robert Beverly Hale. And, you know, I love it because what he does in that book is he teaches you how to think like an artist. And he would often say during his lectures, a layperson will see this part of the anatomy this way. An artist will see it as a form. He'll see it as an egg, or he'll see, and he'll light it that way. And I love that idea of thinking like an artist. So I had Robert Beverly Hale, and then shortly after that, um, Frank Mason. And I kind of married the two together just by instinct.
Mhm.
And what most people do is they want to learn to draw first until they feel like they've mastered drawing and then move on to painting. And it probably works for some people, but Frank's teacher, a fellow named Frank Vincent Dumond, uh, got very frustrated. And Frank told me these stories. I used to work in his studio, so he would tell me these stories. And he said Dumond would get very frustrated because people would be in George Bridgman's class and they could draw like anybody. He said they were master draftsmen. And then they'd come up to my class and they put these beautiful drawings down and they start to color them in. And he said, that's not painting, that's coloring. And he said, there's a difference. And he had to walk them back before he could get them to go forward again. And just sort of by instinct, I did not master drawing before I started painting. And I got to learn the two and I got to marry the two together in a very organic way. So that was a great thing. And one of the other things about Frank Mason is that he not only taught painting, but he also taught the craft. So he would teach you how to prepare canvas and he would teach you how to prepare mediums. And most people wouldn't do it. Most people would just, they'd run down to the store, they'd buy a canvas and they'd come up and start painting. And, eh, you know, I, I said, well, imagine you're a violinist and you're playing at Carnegie Hall. I said, you don't want to run down to the pawn shop just before your concert and grab a violin to play at Carnegie Hall. And if you're going to do a masterpiece, you should do it on a piece of canvas that is worthy of the masterpiece. And so Frank taught me all that, and I worked in his studio. And at the league, we were all painting all the time. It was great. But when I worked in his studio, I would help him prepare canvas and I would help him frame things for shows and create them. So I was learning how to do all of these different things. And I even helped him when he had clients come to the studio. When I first started going down to his studio, he would paint upstairs. He lived upstairs on the top and he had a beautiful he made his own skylight. He punched a hole through the ceiling and made a skylight. And downstairs was the storage and where we did the framing and we made all the noise and made all the sawdust and did all the bad things. But he had a lot of his paintings stacked down there and they were just stacked against the wall. And and my job as he was talking to the client and telling them stories and being very romantic. My job was to move the paintings that were in the stack so that the poor client could see them and they're stacked. I thought this is just awful. And I said, this is a terrible way to look at paintings. And so a few years later, I got together with a friend of mine who was a brilliant carpenter, and we built big hanging racks. So now when you go into his studio, there's a big wall. It's maybe 5 by 10 feet, and it's just pegboard stacked with paintings, and you pull it out, and then you look on the other side, and it's really beautiful. Yeah, but I got to be with him while he was with clients, and that was such an education, to understand that, yes, you're the painter, but you talk about marketing and sales and how do you sell? And he lived on the fourth floor of a building in Little Italy with no elevator. So you had to climb stairs. There are 90 stairs, 89 stairs. I counted them once. There are 89 stairs to get to his studio. And Frank also played the piano when he was young. He was a child prodigy. And he had to give up music because he was dyslexic and he had a hard time reading the music. So he would mostly just, improvise. And so when he had a client come, they would ring the bell and he would send me downstairs to open the door for them. And I'd go down and meet them and greet them, and we'd start climbing up the stairs. And as we're climbing, in the distance, you hear this piano playing. And so we go up, we're at the second floor, and the music gets a little bit louder and louder, and finally we get to the top, and I open the door to the loft, and there's the artist himself sitting at the piano playing something that sounds somewhere between Brahms and Rachmaninoff, and he's just making it up as he goes along. And his studio, uh, he had some old casts, things that were cast from the original. He had the Venus de Milo cast from the original, and that was in one side of his studio. And on the other side, he had the Winged Victory from the Louvre. It's the big Nike. And that was behind the piano. So you walk into this loft, beautiful brick walls, gorgeous paintings everywhere, the artist sitting at the piano, the Winged Victory behind, and I could just see the money flowing out of them. It's like, I want to be a part of this. And he created this atmosphere where, you know, he had completely brought the client into his world. And, I just thought, what an amazing thing. And, you know, it brought somebody up once. This is kind of a side story, but I like it
Mhm.
because it involves me.
Yeah.
And so I brought the client up, and next to the front door, he had uh, these tables, these drawers for drawings, and they were stacked up quite high, about 6 feet high. And on the top, he had a photograph of Frank Dumont. He revered his teacher, and and so the client's there, and we're standing by the door chatting, and the client sees the picture and he says, "Oh, is that your father?" And Mason says, "No, that was my teacher. That was Frank Vincent Dumont. He was my teacher." And then he put his arm around me and he said, "And it was Tom's grand teacher."
Oh.
So so I've always thought of Dumont as my grand teacher, and
Mhm.
anybody who studied with him was an aunt or an uncle. So uh, Uncle Norman Rockwell and all
Yeah.
these great everybody studied with Dumont because he taught for 50 years.
Yeah.
He taught for 59 years, literally. And poor Frank was disappointed when he had to stop teaching because he had only taught for 57. He said, "I wanted to teach as long as Dumont, and I can't do it."
Oh.
But
Oh, wow.
but that was, a great part of what I learned. So at the league, I was learning to paint. I was learning to be a painter and working from the model and doing all these great things. And then when I was in Mason's studio, I was learning what it was like to live the life of an artist. And, the way Frank would teach was by example. So when he was giving critiques in the classroom, he would just work on your painting. He would take the brush and there was the model in front of you and he would use your palette and he would say, this is you need to go here and you need to go there and do this. And then he would start telling stories and he would continue painting and you just watched him paint. And I did the same thing in his studio. I would just watch him live and what it's like to live the life of an artist is something that you don't get out of art school. What is it like when, how do you get up in the morning? How do you get started? How do you do this? How do you get clients? How do you do all these different things? And so I was really incredibly lucky that I had these two incredible mentors. And, at some point I left the class. I kept working at Frank's studio, but I left the classroom and he said, "You weren't in class today." I said, "Frank, I have things I want to paint." I said, I don't want to just paint whoever the office sends up to be the model that week. I have things I want to paint. And he said, "Great." He got it. He said, that's, that's what he wants me to do. He wants you to be an artist. And I think he was kind of pleased that I didn't want to just stay there forever. And so then started my own journey and you start thinking, what do I want to paint? How do I want to paint it? And, I was given all these skills. Now, what do I do with them? And I sort of love that time. Some of my favorite paintings are from that time. And not that they're the best paintings, but, you know, I can remember thinking, I set up a still life and I said, how can I do a painting of essentially dark objects in rim light? You it was a challenge for myself. How do I do that without making just this horrible dark painting? And I always loved that painting. And, I did it and I learned something. And so you're always learning all the time as an artist. But one of the things that Frank did was the craft. So he taught me. So this is how I do a painting. I said my painting starts with I pick out a piece of linen and I have some things that people gave me. I have some leftover scraps from Frank's studio when he passed away and I have all kinds of things. I have a a linen from Utrecht. It's just your basic commercial Utrecht art supplies linen, which I like. It my brush reacts very nicely to it. So I find a piece of linen that you like, and then I prepared it the way the old masters did, with the rabbit skin glue and the white lead. And fortunately, I live in Vermont, so I have a barn. I can do it outdoors. It's much harder when you live in New York City. You can't prepare 80 canvases with white lead and leave them in your apartment while you're sleeping.